Fiona Donovan was still wearing her waitress uniform, still smelling of stale beer and cigarette smoke from a 12-hour night shift, when her mother-in-law grabbed a fistful of her hair and dragged her across the marble foyer of the Ashcroft estate. She hadn't even had time to change her clothes. She hadn't even had time to set down her bag. Patricia Ashcroft, 58 years old and draped in pearls that cost more than Fiona made in a year, threw her daughter-in-law's suitcase down the front steps and hissed the words that would echo in Fiona's mind for the rest of her life. "You cheap little waitress, my son is dead. You're nothing to this family anymore. Get out." Her father-in-law watched from the staircase and said nothing. Her brother-in-law smirked from the doorway and said nothing. Her sister-in-law turned her face away and said nothing. Not one member of the family Fiona had endured endless humiliation under their roof for 6 agonizing months since her husband's passing. Lifted a single finger as she knelt on the cold stone steps, gathering her scattered clothes with trembling hands, 27 years old and utterly alone in the world. What none of them noticed was the black Maybach parked across the street, and the man inside it 36 years old, dressed in a suit that cost more than the car Fiona slept in that night, with gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. His name was Dario Ferrante, and he was the most powerful and most feared man in New York. A man whose name made bankers sweat and senators return phone calls. A man who controlled the ports, the casinos, and half the real estate in Manhattan. His knuckles turned white around the door handle as he watched her being thrown out like garbage. But he didn't get out of the car. He couldn't. Not yet. Because Dario Ferrante was carrying 2 secrets, a promise he'd made to a dying man, and a debt he'd been keeping for 8 long years, a debt that no amount of money could ever repay. Here's what Patricia Ashcroft didn't know as she slammed that $10,000 mahogany door. The poor waitress she'd just thrown onto the street, the girl she'd forced to serve drinks in a Brooklyn bar just to earn the right to claim her own husband's ashes, would wake up the next morning inside the Mafia boss's $50 million oceanfront mansion in Southampton, holding a set of keys engraved with her name, keys he'd had made long before she ever knew he existed. And here's what Fiona Donovan didn't know as she cried herself to sleep in the front seat of her rusted Honda that night. Her husband's death 6 months earlier wasn't an accident. The family that despised her was drowning in a lie 2 decades deep, and the dangerous man, about to knock on her car window at sunrise, had been waiting 8 years for the chance to finally repay her. The same people who smiled as she walked away, who called her worthless, who made her beg for her dead husband's remains, were about to learn they'd thrown away the one person who could have saved them all, because in less than 24 hours, everything, the money, the power, the carefully polished Ashcroft name would begin to crumble, and the only question left was how far Fiona would go once she finally learned the truth about who she really was to the most dangerous man in New York. If you believe that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, has the right to treat another human being like they're worthless, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't decided by the people who reject them. And subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be told to the very end. Now, let's go back to that cold October morning on the front steps of the Ashcroft estate where it all began. The mahogany door slammed shut behind Fiona, and the sound rang inside her chest like one final hammer blow, driving down the lid of a coffin over a marriage that no longer had a husband in it. She knelt on the stone steps, both knees numb from the chill of October, seeping through the thin fabric of her uniform pants, and began picking up each scattered thing one by one. An old sweater Grant had once draped over her shoulders during a power outage, a pair of shoes with worn-down soles, a tin box filled with needles and thread, the only thing left from the years when she had once dreamed of wearing a nursing uniform. Her fingers were so cold she could no longer feel them, only fumbling blindly across the stone as though they belonged to a stranger. From the corner of the garden, Mr. Walsh, the old gardener already past 60, stood silently beside the half-trimmed rose hedge. He didn't dare come forward. At the Ashcroft estate, even kindness needed permission. But his eyes looked at her with a pity that, over the past 6 months, not one member of that family had ever given her. And when Fiona lifted her head and met that gaze, she nearly broke into tears. A person can endure cruelty for a very long time, but one unexpected touch of tenderness is enough to make every wall collapse. She bit down hard on her lip, tucked the wedding photograph frame into the suitcase, zipped it shut with trembling hands, and told herself she wouldn't cry here. Not in front of this door. Not in front of those windows, where she knew for certain someone was standing behind the curtains looking down. She dragged the suitcase clattering along the long gravel path that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, every step feeling as if it added another mile. And inside her mind, the only question kept repeating itself over and over. What had she done wrong? But she knew the answer. She knew it clearly. 3 days earlier, she had done the one thing no one in the Ashcroft house had permitted her to do. She had gone on her own to Whitmore and Son Funeral Home in Westchester, the place that kept Grant's cremation records, and asked a question so simple it hurt, when she would be allowed to receive her husband's ashes. The funeral home manager had looked at her in confusion, turned through the records, then said that every decision belonged to Mrs. Patricia Ashcroft, that there were very specific instructions, and that he was very sorry. Fiona had stood there in the middle of a room scented with lilies and candle wax, listening to a stranger tell her she had no rights at all to the man she had shared a bed and a life with for 3 years. She had only asked. She hadn't even raised her voice. But that very evening, someone at the funeral home called Patricia, and the sentence was handed down the next morning, just as Fiona had dragged her exhausted body home after 12 hours of serving tables. It turned out that in the world of the Ashcrofts, the greatest crime a widow could commit was daring to ask for her husband's remains. The rusted Honda started after 3 tries, the engine coughing and sputtering like an old sick man. Fiona drove out through the iron gates without looking back, following the suburban roads of Westchester, covered in red maple leaves, the million-dollar houses slowly receding in the rearview mirror, like a dream that had never belonged to her. She kept driving, without direction, over the bridge, through the morning traffic, deep into the heart of Brooklyn, past the old laundromat where she and Grant had once sat waiting for their clothes to dry and shared a single bagel, past the street corner with the diner where he had first asked her to be his, places that now existed only as knives cutting into memory. The gas tank drained slowly as the long day wore on. The money left in her wallet was $43 and a few loose coins, the tips from her final night shift. No hotel in New York could take in someone with that much money for more than 2 nights. When darkness fell, she pulled the car into a riverside parking lot in Red Hook, where shipping containers were stacked on top of one another, like giant blocks of tombstone, and the harbor lights spilled a sickly yellow glow across the surface of the East River. She locked the car doors, lowered the seat back, and took the wedding photograph frame from her suitcase. In the picture, Grant was smiling, that slightly crooked smile that had undone her from the very first glance, his hand around her waist in front of the white lighthouse, the wind tossing the $40 wedding dress she had bought from a thrift shop. Happiness had been that cheap then, and that real. Her breath gathered in a misty film on the car window, and outside, the temperature kept falling hour by hour. She curled into herself inside her thin coat, clutching the picture frame against her chest, as though she were holding a chest that was still warm. And for the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to sob aloud, crying for the husband lying inside an urn she wasn't allowed to touch, crying for 6 months spent on her knees, serving others, in exchange for a promise that kept moving farther and farther out of reach, crying for the orphaned child she had once been, now left once more without even a roof over her head. "My love," she whispered into the cold glass. "What am I supposed to do now?" No one answered. There was only the mournful groan of a ship's horn far out in the harbor, and the steady sound of river water striking the seawall. She fell asleep without knowing when, utterly spent, her lashes still wet, never realizing that on the other side of the city, in a room overlooking all of glittering Manhattan, a man was setting down on his desk a photograph taken from a distance of her, kneeling on the steps that morning, and saying to the old lawyer standing before him exactly 4 words, "It's time now." In her broken sleep on the car seat that night, memories came back to Fiona the way the tide returns to shore, without permission, without warning. She saw herself again as a 6-year-old girl standing before the gate of the children's home in Newark, New Jersey, carrying a plastic bag with 2 sets of clothes and a stuffed rabbit missing 1 ear. Her parents had died in an accident, and she could no longer remember their faces, only the faint scent of her mother's perfume and the deep sound of her father's laughter, fragments too small to piece together into a home. The next 12 years were a chain of foster families one after another, some kind, some taking her in only for the monthly assistance check, and everywhere she went, she learned the same lesson: never put down roots anywhere, because the deeper the roots grow, the more it hurts when they're torn out. But that little girl had one stubborn dream no one could pull from the ground. At 18, Fiona was accepted into the nursing program at a community college, the first foster child from the home to continue her education. She wanted to become a nurse for one simple reason. She knew too well what it felt like to be in pain with no one beside her, and she didn't want anyone in the world to have to go through that alone. She studied as if her life were hanging from every page of the textbook, memorizing how to disinfect a wound, how to hold a needle, how to make each stitch perfectly even on a piece of practice skin. Her hands so skillful that her elderly instructor once held them and said these were hands born to heal. But dreams needed money, and money didn't dream alongside her. Tuition rose in her second year. Her loan was denied because she had no cosigner, no parents, no property, no last name with any weight behind it. Fiona left the classroom on a rainy afternoon, clutching her practice sewing kit as if she were holding an unfinished promise, and took a night shift waiting tables just to survive, telling herself it would only be for one semester. One semester became a year, 1 year became many years, and life swept her along that way. Until an autumn morning when she was 24, at a small diner in Brooklyn where she worked the counter, a man stepped in to escape a sudden shower, his suit soaked through, ordered a cup of black coffee, and sat there for 3 full hours just watching her work. His name was Grant. He came back the next day, and the day after that, week after week, always sitting in the same chair by the window, always ordering the same thing, and always leaving a tip with a napkin scribbled in haste. Sometimes with a joke so bad she had to laugh, sometimes with only 3 words, "You smiled less today." It wasn't until the second month that he found enough courage to ask her to dinner. And it wasn't until their third date that she learned how heavy the Ashcroft name behind his own truly was. Grant was the youngest son of a restaurant and hotel empire, but he spoke of that inheritance the way people speak of a hereditary disease. He said that all his life, people had seen his last name before they saw him, and that she was the first person who had looked straight at him without blinking. When he brought her home to meet his family, dinner at the Westchester mansion lasted exactly 40 minutes. Patricia didn't ask Fiona a single question, only told her son in a flat voice that he could fool around with someone like that, but marriage was out of the question. Grant set his napkin down on the table, took Fiona's hand, stood up, and the last thing he said before that mahogany door closed behind them both was, "If she isn't family, then neither am I." They married at City Hall on a Tuesday morning, with Fiona wearing the $40 white dress she had bought from a thrift shop. Their witnesses the diner owner and the flower vendor from the corner, who gave them a bouquet of white daisies for free. The Ashcroft family cut off every account, erased his name from everything, and Grant only smiled, took a lowly job as a financial analyst at a small company, and woke early every morning to make coffee for his wife before she came home from her night shift. 3 years in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, where the pipes groaned every winter, were the richest 3 years of Fiona's life. They were so poor their honeymoon was only a 2-day weekend, driving the old Honda all the way to Montauk Point, where the white lighthouse stood watch before the Atlantic Ocean. That night, the wind was fierce, and the two of them spread a blanket on the grass, shared a bottle of cheap wine, and Grant pointed toward the light sweeping slow circles through the darkness and said, "You see that? No matter how dark and wild the sea is out there, that light has never stopped shining. Someday, if we ever get lost from each other, we'll meet back here." She had laughed and pinched his arm, telling him he was too sentimental and shouldn't say unlucky things. On the freezing car seat in Red Hook, Fiona woke with a start in the darkness just before dawn, her cheeks soaked, not knowing how long she had been crying in her sleep. The harbor lights outside were still a sickly yellow. The wedding photograph was still lying in her arms, and the Montauk lighthouse in the picture was still standing there, white and silent behind the shoulders of 2 people who were laughing. "You told me if we ever got lost, we'd meet at the lighthouse," she whispered, "and then you went somewhere I can't find the road to." She didn't know that in only a few more minutes, when the first streak of dawn touched the river's surface, there would be a gentle knock on the window right beside her head. In the final minutes before dawn, while the night still lingered over the river at Red Hook. The heaviest piece of memory finally found its way back to Fiona, the one she had spent the past 6 months trying to press down into the bottom of her heart, the way someone presses an iron box to the bottom of the sea. That night had been an April night. She was reheating a pot of soup, waiting for her husband to come home for a late dinner, when the phone rang, an unfamiliar number, and the voice of a New York State Patrol officer came through in a steady tone, as if he were reading from a report, saying there had been a serious crash on the Taconic Highway while her husband was returning from a business trip upstate, that the car had slid off a curve and gone down the embankment, that the driver had been identified as Grant Ashcroft, and that she should sit down before he said the next sentence. Fiona didn't remember whether she sat down or collapsed, only that the soup boiled over on the stove while she stood there watching it as though it were happening in another world, and the sound of the ambulance siren through the phone seemed terribly far away, as if echoing up from the bottom of the ocean. The days that followed passed through a thick fog of sedatives and paperwork, but the Ashcroft family didn't slow down for even a single beat. They moved with frightening speed. Less than 72 hours after the accident, when Fiona hadn't even managed to choose the suit her husband would wear for the last time, a group of lawyers knocked on the door of the Brooklyn apartment with a thick stack of documents proving that the apartment was held in the family trust, not in Grant's name, that he had only been allowed to live there, and that someone allowed to live there had no right to pass it on to his wife. She had 30 days to move out. The funeral was held privately by the Ashcroft family in the family chapel in Westchester, a service where the widowed wife herself had to sit in the third row, behind the business partners, and when everything ended, Grant's urn was placed in a stone niche behind the bronze door of the chapel, where only those who carried the Ashcroft name had a key. Fiona had stood before that bronze door and begged to bring her husband home, begged to scatter his ashes in the place he had once told her about, and Patricia had looked down at her, with eyes that held not the faintest ripple of grief, then said that a dead man who bore the Ashcroft name would remain with the Ashcroft family, and if Fiona wanted to change that, she would have to pay the price. The price was presented 1 week later in the walnut-paneled study of the mansion, in the form of a pre-printed contract whose every line Fiona still knew by heart. The Ashcroft family declared that when Grant died, he had left behind personal debts to the family, debts he had never mentioned to his wife, not even once, and that as his spouse, she had a moral duty to carry them in his place. The first clause stated that Fiona would work as a waitress at the Gilded Anchor, a bar in Red Hook, for 1 full year, and her entire wage would be seized and deducted directly from the debt, while she would be allowed to keep only her tips. The second clause stated that she had to move into the Westchester mansion under the family's supervision, so they could be certain she wouldn't run away from her obligation. In exchange, when the year was complete, Grant's urn would belong to her. Her own lawyer, had she been able to afford one, surely would have torn that contract apart right there at the table. But she had no money, no one, and on the scale of her heart, a year on her knees was nothing compared with being able to bring her husband home in her arms. She signed. Patricia took the paper back with a smile as thin as a paper knife, and the only thing that struck Fiona as strange, the strangeness she would only much later understand in all its weight, was why a family that owned dozens of elegant restaurants across Manhattan would push their daughter-in-law into working at one particular, shabby bar buried deep in the Red Hook docks, a place that had nothing to do with the Ashcroft empire, as though her presence in that exact place, not the wages being seized, was what they truly needed. Over the next 6 months, her life shrank into a loop. By day, she was an invisible person inside the mansion, and by night she put on her uniform and stood behind the bar from 8 o'clock at night until 8 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by the smell of stale beer, tinny music, and the hands of drunken customers she had to learn to dodge. The only thing that kept her standing at the Gilded Anchor was Casey Malone, her 26-year-old red-haired co-worker with a smile bigger than her whole face, who on Fiona's very first night had pressed a pair of soft shoe inserts into her hand and announced that in this place the two girls had to survive together. Casey never asked why someone as softly spoken as Fiona had fallen into a place like this. She only quietly switched shifts with her on the days Fiona was exhausted, and split her sandwich with her on the nights Fiona forgot to eat. It was also Cassie who first noticed something strange. One night, she leaned close to Fiona's ear and whispered, "Have you noticed that table in the dark corner? In the darkest VIP corner of the bar, where the lights never quite reached, a man in a black suit would appear from time to time, sitting alone, never drinking more than one glass, never speaking to anyone, and on the nights he appeared, even the drunkest customers somehow sat a little straighter and lowered their voices." Fiona had never clearly seen his face, only twice feeling a gaze settle on her from that darkness, not crude like the stare of drunken men, but silent and heavy as stone. Then he would vanish for weeks at a time, only to appear again, like a question no one dared ask aloud. The memory of those 6 months went out when the first streak of morning light touched the river's surface, and in that same instant, exactly like an appointment fate had already written down, 3 soft, slow knocks sounded on the car window, right beside Fiona's head. Fiona jolted upright, her heart pounding, her hand instinctively snatching up the picture frame, as if it were the only thing anyone could still steal from her. Through the glass blurred with breath and moisture, she saw 2 figures standing a politely measured distance from the car, and behind them, parked motionless along the seawall, was a long, glossy black car that looked out of place in the harbor district, like a black panther that had wandered into a scrapyard. The man standing closer was an old gentleman with neatly combed silver hair, wearing a gray overcoat, one hand holding an old leather briefcase that had clearly been carefully preserved, his face carrying the calm expression of men who had spent their whole lives working with papers and secrets. Seeing that she was awake, he stepped back half a pace and lightly held a business card against the window. Everett Shaw, Shaw and Associates Law Office. Fiona lowered the window just over an inch, enough to hear, not enough for a hand to slip through. She had lived long enough to know that strange men at dawn in Red Hook rarely brought good news. "I don't have any money," she said, her voice hoarse after a night of crying, "and I don't owe anyone anything." The old lawyer gave a faint smile, more sad than pleased, then said, "Mrs. Ashcroft, we haven't come to collect. We've come to deliver." He said he represented the wishes of Grant Ashcroft, that there were arrangements her late husband had made before his death, arrangements placed in trust with one single condition for activation. And that condition, he hesitated for 1 second, as though he himself felt pain reading it aloud, was that they were to be carried out only when she no longer had anywhere to go. Fiona sat motionless. "Grant has been dead for 6 months. Dead men can't arrange anything anymore," she said. And it was then that the second man stepped forward, the tall man in a black suit without a tie, and when the dawn light slanted across his shoulder, Fiona suddenly recognized the motionless figure from the VIP corner of the Gilded Anchor on those nights, recognized that silent gaze as heavy as stone, now less than 7 feet away from her, in a pair of ash-gray eyes. He bent down to the level of the car window, without touching the car, and said in a deep, slow voice, each word falling clear and distinct like coins striking stone, "Your husband left something for you, and I owe you a debt 8 years overdue. 8 years. Fiona searched through her memory and found nothing. 8 years earlier, she had been 19 years old. She had never met this man in her life, certainly not, because a face like that was not something anyone could see and then forget. "Who are you?" she asked. The man didn't answer that question. He only straightened and said, "You can follow or you can stay. I never force anyone into my car." Then he turned and walked back toward the black car, leaving her space to decide for herself, and strangely, it was precisely the way he didn't persuade her, didn't promise anything, didn't plead, that made Fiona feel this wasn't a trap, because traps were always sweet. Mr. Shaw remained a moment longer, placed a thin envelope in her hand, and said quietly, "Inside is a copy of the authorization bearing your husband's signature, notarized 14 months ago. Read it. We'll wait. 14 months ago. That meant 8 months before Grant died. That meant when he sees these papers, he had still been alive, still kissing her forehead every morning, and had already been quietly preparing for a day when she would have nowhere left to go." The signature in the envelope was truly his, that familiar left-leaning hand she had seen thousands of times on diner napkins. Fiona sat in the car for another 10 minutes, both hands gripping the steering wheel. Reason screaming at her not to trust this, that life had never given her any gift without a price attached. But she looked down at the empty gas tank, looked at the $43 in her wallet, looked at the wedding photograph on the passenger seat, and understood that she had nothing left for anyone to take. She started the engine and followed the black car out of Red Hook just as the city was waking. They drove east, farther and farther from the blocks of concrete, through Long Island as the sun gradually rose, with rows of maple trees burning on both sides of the road, and late autumn vineyards glowing yellow gold. Nearly 3 hours with Fiona driving like a sleepwalker, until the black car turned onto a private road shaded by old oaks in Southampton, and stopped before an iron gate with unexpectedly simple scrollwork. The gate opened without a sound. At the end of the gentle slope the villa appeared in the morning light, with gray stone walls and tall windows, neither gaudy nor showy, but quiet and solid, like a fortress that had learned how to smile. 2 broad-shouldered men standing on either side of the porch bowed their heads slightly as they passed, and the moment the front door opened, the first thing that reached Fiona wasn't luxury but scent. The deep, warm fragrance of cedar wood, mingled with beeswax polished into the floors, the smell of a place cared for with devotion rather than money. The long hallway stretched endlessly beneath a soaring ceiling, windows spilling golden sunlight across the wooden floor, and there was not a single portrait, not a single trophy, not a trace of anything meant to flaunt the man who owned it. The gray-eyed man stopped in the middle of the grand foyer, took a set of keys from the inner pocket of his jacket, placed them on the stone table, and gently pushed them toward her. On the silver key ring, engraved in a delicate script, were 2 words that made Fiona's knees almost give way: Fiona Donovan. Not Ashcroft, but Donovan, her own name, the name she had carried before she belonged to anyone. "Your husband had one wish," the man said, his voice dropping another shade lower. "He wanted you to have a place you could walk into without asking anyone's permission." Fiona looked at the keys for a long time without touching them. "I don't accept things I don't understand," she finally said, her voice trembling, though her eyes did not leave his. "What happened 8 years ago? Who are you to my husband? And why is my name already waiting inside the house of a man I've never met?" The man looked at her for a long while, and in those gray eyes, something passed very quickly, something almost like respect. "Every answer is in the reading room," he said. "Your husband left you more than keys. He left you letters." The reading room lay at the end of the western hallway, where the early sunlight passed through tall glass windows and fell across dark wooden bookshelves. And in the middle of the room, on a table covered in green baize, a steel bank deposit box sat waiting, its seal still unbroken. Mr. Shaw stood beside the table, put on his reading glasses, and explained in the slow voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment for a long time, that 14 months earlier, Grant Ashcroft had come to his office with this box and a set of instructions detailed down to every comma, that inside was a series of sealed letters, each numbered, to be given to his wife in the exact order specified, each letter to be opened only after the previous one had been read, and all of it to be activated by one single condition. Grant had written into the trust agreement with his own hand. Mr. Shaw turned the paper toward Fiona so she could read for herself that familiar left-leaning line of handwriting: "Deliver only when she has nowhere left to go." Fiona stood silent before those words for a very long time. There was something both warm and icy cold in the fact that her husband had foreseen with such precision the day his wife would be thrown out into the street. Warm because he had prepared, icy cold because he had known beforehand and never told her a single word. Mr. Shaw cut the seal, opened the lid of the box, and inside, arranged neatly like the bricks of a path someone had already paved, were thick cream paper envelopes, each one bearing a handwritten number in the corner, and on top, set apart from the rest, envelope number 1, with 3 words on it, read "My love." Mr. Shaw and the gray-eyed man quietly stepped back and closed the door, leaving her alone with her dead husband. Fiona sat down in the armchair, holding the envelope against her chest for a long while before she dared to open it, because she knew, with the instinct of someone who had lost too much, that once these lines were read, her old world would no longer remain whole. Then she drew a deep breath and opened it. Grant's handwriting filled 3 pages, that slightly rushed, left-leaning script in the emotional passages, exactly the way he used to write on napkins all those years ago, and by the very first line, her tears had already fallen. "My love, if you're reading these lines, it means I've broken my promise. It means I didn't make it home in time for some dinner. And it means the people who carry my name have done exactly the thing I feared most. They have pushed you into the street. I'm sorry, I'm sorry I left you kneeling there to pick up your things alone. I'm sorry for everything you had to endure without me standing beside you." Fiona had to stop, pressing the page to her chest, breathing in short, sharp pulls like someone about to drown, before she had enough strength to read on. Grant wrote that a little more than a year before writing this letter, through his work as a financial analyst, he had accidentally seen something he never should have seen, something connected to his family, and from that day on, he had known he was walking on a thin sheet of ice stretched over an abyss. He didn't write clearly what it was, only that the truth was too dangerous to place entirely inside one letter, that he had divided it into many pieces the way people divide poison into doses small enough not to kill the one who drinks it, and that she had to go through the letters one by one, not rushing, not skipping ahead, because each truth needed time for her heart to learn how to bear it. Then came the passage that froze the blood in Fiona's veins, the passage he had written with words pressed so hard into the paper it was as though his own hand had been shaking while he wrote them. "You have to prepare yourself for this, and I hate myself for being the one who has to say it. But if one day you hear that I've had an accident, that my car slid off a mountain road, caught fire, exploded, or anything else that sounds like fate, remember one thing. My accident won't be an accident." The paper slipped from Fiona's hand. She heard a strange sound in the room and needed a second to realize it was her own sob. For 6 months she had mourned an unlucky husband, had cursed the fatal curve on the Taconic highway, had tormented herself with the thought that if only she had called him home earlier that night, and now it turned out there had been no fate at all, no curve at all, only some hand that had pressed the button, and her husband had spent the final months of his life with a death sentence hanging above his head, while still making coffee for his wife every morning, still smiling, still silently carrying it all alone so she could sleep in peace. She collapsed against the edge of the table and cried as she had never been allowed to cry, cried until her strength was gone. And then, from the very bottom of that exhaustion, something else began to kindle, not hope, but a question sharp as a knife. Who? She picked up the letter and read it again, then again, trying to find a name, a clue, but Grant had accounted for even that. At the end he wrote, "Don't guess, my love. Guessing wrong is more dangerous than not knowing. Follow the letters, and trust the man who gave them to you. He owes you something even you don't remember, and I've never seen anyone guard a debt so carefully." When Fiona stepped out of the reading room, the afternoon was already slanting toward evening, her eyes swollen, but her back straight, and the gray-eyed man was waiting at the head of the hallway, asking no questions, offering no comfort, only looking at her with the gaze of someone who understood that there were pains no words could reach. "I'm staying," Fiona said, not as a question, not asking permission. "I'm staying until I've read every letter and understand everything." The man nodded once, then said, "This house has 3 rules," his voice unchanged, though every word carried the weight of something that couldn't be negotiated. 1. You don't leave the grounds alone. Wherever you go, one of my people goes with you. 2. The letters and everything in the reading room are not to be mentioned to anyone outside these 4 walls, not even the person closest to you. And 3. Never ask about my work, because the answer won't make your life better. Fiona looked straight into those gray eyes, and for the first time after a long day of swaying on the edge, her voice steadied. "I have one rule of my own," she said. "Never lie to me, even when the truth hurts me. I've lived 6 months inside a false mourning. I'd rather die from the truth than survive on a lie." Something moved across the man's stone-cold face, too quickly to name. Perhaps surprise, perhaps something deeper than that. Then he nodded a second time, slower than the first, like an unspoken oath, and said, "Then we have an agreement, Mrs. Ashcroft." "Her name is Donovan," Fiona corrected, her eyes never leaving him. "Fiona Donovan, like the name on the key ring." And that first night, in a bedroom scented with cedarwood and the distant echo of waves, Fiona placed the wedding photograph on the bedside table, lay down on the first soft mattress she had known in many nights, and realized something both comforting and frightening, that the safest place she had had since losing her husband was the house of the man all of New York bowed before in fear. During her first days in Southampton, Fiona lived like a boarder inside her own silence, and the villa taught her its rhythm little by little. Morning began with the crunch of gravel beneath the wheels of black cars, coming and going before 6 o'clock, the steady tap of leather shoes along the eastern hallway where she had been told she didn't need to go. then the smell of dark roasted coffee drifting from the large kitchen, where Rosa, the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman of Sicilian descent who spoke English with an island lilt, always kept a warm meal waiting for her no matter what time she came down. The man who coordinated that entire machine was a thin old man named Aldo Bruni, past 60, slightly stooped, always dressed in a gray suit buttoned all the way to the throat, a man whom the bodyguards twice his size all addressed as Sir with absolute reverence. Aldo introduced himself to Fiona as the advisor to the Ferrante house, having served this family since the time of Mr. Dario's father, and it was from his mouth that she first heard the full name of the gray-eyed man, Dario Ferrante. A name that, when she accidentally repeated it a little too loudly in the kitchen, made Rosa instinctively glance toward the window, as if afraid the wind might carry it too far. Aldo treated Fiona with an old-world courtesy that left her uneasy, pulling out chairs for her, calling her Miss Donovan, but his eyes were always watching her as if he were reading a contract in search of a hidden clause, and once, when she helped Rosa bandage a finger cut by a knife, with practiced motions that required no thought, Fiona caught Aldo standing in the doorway, looking at her hands with a strange expression, as though he had just found the hidden clause he had been looking for. As for the master of the house, his presence was like that of a mountain, silent, yet impossible not to feel. Dario Ferrante left before dawn and returned after midnight, disappeared completely on some days, and on the rare dinners when the two of them met at opposite ends of the long table with 12 chairs, he ate little, spoke even less, asking only one question, whether she needed anything, before sinking back into silence. But Fiona recognized, with the intuition of someone who had served thousands of faces, that his silence was not indifference, because the cup of chamomile tea she had left half-finished only once during her first week was, from then on, placed every evening in the reading room by someone, brewed to exactly the strength she liked, and the thin blanket she had once carried out to the porch, while watching the sea on a sleepless night, had been folded neatly and placed on that same porch chair the next morning, like a quiet permission. But if the house held that kind of warmth, it also had nights that made Fiona remember what kind of creature's den she was sleeping in. One night in late October, she woke to the sound of many cars returning at once, doors closing in haste. Then from the outbuilding across the courtyard came sounds even the thick stone walls couldn't swallow completely. A man's voice pleading again and again about something, Aldo's voice steady as if reciting a prayer, and above all, the silence of a third person she couldn't hear but knew with certainty was there, because the other two voices were both trembling toward that silence. The next morning, a chair in the outbuilding was carried out and replaced. The young guard, who often whistled at the gate, disappeared from his shift forever. Rosa wiped the table more thoroughly than usual and didn't sing, while Dario sat at the head of the breakfast table, shirt sleeves neatly rolled, reading the financial paper as though the night before had been nothing more than a storm that had passed. Fiona stood in the dining room doorway, her heart beating slow and heavy, wondering whether she should be afraid or whether she should run, and at that exact moment he lifted his eyes from the paper. For 1 second she saw two men, inside the same pair of gray eyes, the ice from last night not yet fully melted, and beneath it, when he realized the person standing in the doorway was her, something softened almost imperceptibly, like stone meeting early sunlight. He nodded in greeting, pushed the plate of bread toward the nearest chair, then lowered his gaze back to the paper, and Fiona realized that the most frightening thing was not that this man was cruel, but that his cruelty had not once, not even by the width of a hair, turned toward her. That night she sat for a long time before the wedding photograph, and for the first time she forced herself to name the feeling that had been slipping into the past few days, the way her heart missed a beat when she heard his car come home, the way she drank the tea set out for her and felt her throat tighten because someone had remembered her, and she was horrified by herself. "You've only been gone 6 months," she whispered to the crooked smile in the photograph. "I'm still wearing mourning inside my heart. I haven't even been able to bring your ashes home. I have no right." And she took the steaming cup of chamomile tea that night and poured it down the sink like a punishment she had chosen for herself. But the tears still fell for a reason she didn't dare look at directly, because that punishment hurt more than she had expected. From the next day on, she avoided Dario, eating at different hours, walking different paths, and he noticed at once, of course. That man noticed everything, but instead of asking, he simply stepped back to exactly the distance she needed. The tea was still placed there every evening, but now it came with a blank, unsigned card bearing only one line in sharp, straight handwriting. "You don't owe anyone your loneliness." Fiona held that card and stood for a very long time by the reading room window, where the numbered envelopes still lay waiting inside the steel box. And she understood that she couldn't keep standing still between these two worlds forever. One side, holding the husband who was gone with secrets not yet opened, the other holding the living man she wasn't allowed to understand. She reached for envelope number 2, and before she could touch the seal, the gate bell rang out in a rapid burst, tearing through the quiet afternoon, followed by the guard's voice over the radio, saying that 4 people claiming to carry the Ashcroft name were standing at the gate, and they said they had come to take their daughter-in-law home. Fiona placed envelope number 2 back inside the steel box, locked the reading room with the very key that bore her name, then stepped into the grand foyer, and through the security screen beside the door, she saw them, the 4 people who had stood still and watched her kneel to gather her clothes, now standing before the iron gate in Southampton in their finest clothes. Patricia in a cream-colored overcoat and silk scarf, Richard standing straight as a pillar rotted through inside, Preston with a gold watch flashing at his wrist, and Brooke slightly behind them, her eyes fixed on her shoes. Aldo appeared beside Fiona without a sound, and quietly asked whether the young lady would like him to send them away. Only one nod would be enough, but Fiona looked at the screen for one more second, then shook her head. "Let them in," she said. "Some doors have to be closed by your own hand before they truly stay shut." She didn't change out of the simple knit dress she was wearing, didn't put on makeup, only stood waiting in the cedar-scented grand foyer. And when the 4 Ashcrofts crossed the threshold, she saw clearly the moment their eyes slid away from her to climb toward the soaring ceiling, sweep over the stone walls, the windows filled with light, measuring every square foot by the instinct of people who had spent their whole lives turning everything into money. Patricia was the first to recover, and she stepped into her role at once, her face arranged into a mask of sorrow, both hands reaching forward. "My child," she said in a voice Fiona had never once heard during 6 months under the same roof, "the whole family has been searching everywhere for you. I haven't slept since that morning. I lost my senses in anger. What family doesn't have clashes now and then?" Then she took from her handbag a society magazine folded open to a page, with a distant photograph of Fiona stepping out of a car before the gates of this villa, accompanied by a suggestive caption about the mysterious female guest at Southampton's most private estate. "When I saw this picture, my heart clenched," Patricia said. "My daughter-in-law, the wife of my Grant. Why are you in a place like this? Do you know what kind of man owns this house?" Fiona didn't answer right away. She looked at the magazine, then looked at the woman before her, and inside her, something quietly completed itself, like the final brick being set into a wall. "For 6 months I lived under your roof," she said, her voice even and clear, "and not once did you ask whether I had eaten, whether I had slept, whether I was all right. But the moment there's a photograph of me standing in front of a house bigger than yours, you lose sleep, mother. I waited tables long enough to know whether a customer calls me over because he's thirsty, or because he wants to throw a drink in my face." And Preston, unable to bear that calm, stepped forward and said bluntly what the whole family was thinking. "Drop the innocent act. Your husband isn't even cold in his grave, and you're already climbing into bed with a Mafia boss. You think all of New York doesn't know whose house this is. What does a waitress have to offer to get into a place like this besides her body?" He hadn't even finished the sentence when the air in the grand foyer changed completely, not because anyone had spoken, but because a door in the eastern hallway had just opened and the sound of measured footsteps was approaching. But Fiona lifted one hand slightly toward those footsteps, a small gesture, almost unconscious. "Wait, please, let me." And the strange thing was that the footsteps really stopped. The most powerful man in New York stopped at the edge of the grand foyer because a waitress had raised her hand, folded his arms, leaned against the doorframe, and gave the floor to her. "Preston," Fiona said, turning fully toward her brother-in-law, "I knelt on the steps of your house and picked up every piece of clothing I owned, while you stood inside the door, watching and laughing. I slept in a car in the middle of October, and not one of you made a single phone call. Yet today you drove 3 hours here, Not to ask how I survived, but to ask who I slept with. Let me tell you something. A woman who served beer 12 hours a night so she could bring home her husband's ashes doesn't need to prove her dignity to the people who used that urn as a condition. As for where I stay and how I live, from the moment your mother threw my suitcase onto the steps, it stopped being any business of the Ashcroft family. Richard, who had stayed silent until now, just as he had stayed silent through the past 6 months, finally cleared his throat and awkwardly said that perhaps the past should be left in the past, that family matters should be handled behind closed doors, that she should come home and everyone would review the contract, maybe even shorten the term. And it was that hurried bargaining tone, the way all 4 of them needed her back so badly, that raised in Fiona a question she had not yet had time to name, before Patricia added, her voice less sweet now, "Don't forget that you're still legally bound to this family. Walk away from that contract and don't dream of touching the urn. And don't blame this family if we stop being considerate and take this to court." Only then did the man by the door leave his place. Dario Ferrante crossed the grand foyer with steps neither fast nor slow, stopped beside Fiona, exactly half an arm's length away, not touching her, and spoke for the first time, his voice deep and calm as if discussing the weather. "Court is an excellent idea," he said. "I encourage it because the court will need to examine the books, and Mrs. Ashcroft, I know precisely how much the Ashcroft family owes, down to the last cent. Just 1 sentence. No threat, no raised voice, no explanation." But Fiona stood close enough to see its effect spread across the 4 faces before them like a layer of ice. Patricia's smile froze halfway. Richard's throat bobbed up and down. The gold watch on Preston's wrist lightly struck his cuff because his hand had just trembled. And Brooke, for the first time throughout the confrontation, lifted her eyes and looked straight at Fiona with something in them that looked very much like a plea for help. No one said another word. Patricia adjusted her silk scarf with fingers that were no longer graceful, let out a distorted farewell toward empty air, and all 4 of them withdrew so quickly, they even forgot to close the car doors gently. Fiona stood beside the tall window and watched the line of cars disappear beyond the oaks, with only one thought left in her mind, growing louder like a drumbeat. They weren't afraid of the Mafia. Those arrogant people had dared to cross the gate of a Mafia house that very morning to demand someone back. But they were deathly afraid of a debt ledger, and if one single sentence about books was enough to make the entire Ashcroft family flee, then whatever lay inside Grant's letters had to be powerful enough to bury every last one of them. That night, Fiona waited no longer. Once the Ashcroft family's convoy had disappeared completely, and the villa had sunk back into stillness, she went straight to the reading room, turned on the amber desk lamp, and broke the seal of envelope number 2 with hands that had stopped trembling, because after that afternoon, she understood that fear was a luxury she could no longer afford to keep. The second letter was thicker than the first, and right below the familiar greeting, Grant went straight into what he had promised. "My love," he wrote, "if you've read this far, it means you've stood firm through the first truth, so you have the right to know the second truth, the one I accidentally stepped into during a cross-check of figures for work, when I realized that numbers from my own family were appearing where they should never have been allowed to appear. You've always wondered why a family that owns a chain of elegant restaurants across Manhattan is so sickeningly secretive about its books, why the emptiest restaurants in my family always report the highest profits. The answer is very simple and very dirty. The Ashcroft empire doesn't live on food. It lives on money laundering, and it has been doing it for 20 years for a name I'm asking you to carve into your memory, Amon Quinlan." Fiona stopped at that name. She had never heard it before, but the way Grant's pen had pressed deep into the paper when he wrote those 2 words told her enough. Grant explained briefly, in a way so concise it chilled her, that the Quinlan gang's dirty money from the docks and underground gambling houses was fed into Ashcroft restaurants as phantom revenue. Banquets where no one had sat, invoices for meals that had never been served, passing through the family's books and flowing out the other side clean as the money of honest people. 20 years, long enough for the Ashcroft name and the Quinlan name to be chained together by a link where whoever let go first would die first. "I backed up everything," Grant continued. "Every transaction, every signature, every figure, in a safe place. And the man holding the key to that place is the man who brought you to the house where you're sitting now. But you don't need to open it yet. You only need to finish reading the passage below, and I'm sorry, because the passage below is going to hurt." Fiona turned the page, and the next lines made the room seem to tilt. "Have you ever wondered," Grant wrote, "why my mother chose the Gilded Anchor, a shabby bar in Red Hook with no connection to the Ashcroft Empire, as the place where she forced you to work? I asked that question for you before it ever happened, because I knew that if anything happened to me, they wouldn't spare you, and I was so right. I hate myself for being right. The Gilded Anchor is not some random bar, my love. It belongs to Eamon Quinlan. It is one of his money-counting machines, and the contract they forced you to sign, the debt they invented, all of it was only a shell around one single purpose, to place you within Quinlan's sight for 12 hours every night. He suspects, and he suspects correctly, that before I died, I managed to get a copy of the ledger out, and the only person he would believe I could trust enough to give it to, in his eyes, would be my wife. So he needed you close, needed to watch you, needed to know who you met, who you called, what you hid, and my family, instead of shielding their daughter-in-law, carried you with their own hands and placed you in the wolves' den, like bait, supervised bait. At night, under Quinlan's eyes and ears inside the bar, by day within the four walls of the Westchester mansion. The letter shook in Fiona's hands, not because she was shaking, but because the past 6 months were collapsing and rearranging themselves in her mind into a new order, brutal and painfully clear. The clause forcing her to move into the mansion under supervision, which she had once thought existed to humiliate her, had actually existed to guard her. The stares she had believed were only from drunk customers at the bar. It turned out some of those eyes had been paid to watch. The manager, who had never officially entered her name into the payroll records, Patricia's phone calls asking what shift she was working tonight, calls Fiona had mistaken for petty control, all of it, every piece of it, was a link in the same chain, and she had walked, forced smiles, served drinks, and survived for 180 nights in the heart of the territory of the man who had ordered her watched, without ever knowing it. Then one final image rose from memory and slid into place, sending a completely different kind of cold down her spine. The table in the darkest VIP corner, the man in the black suit sitting alone and never drinking more than one glass. It turned out that inside that wolf's den, there had been another pair of eyes too. Eyes that did not belong to Quinlan, is sitting in the darkness and counting every night in order to keep watch over her. Fiona set the letter down on the green baize, sat motionless for a long time, then did something whose calmness surprised even herself. She opened the reading room door, walked down the western hallway, knocked on the door of Dario Ferrante's study at nearly midnight, and when the door opened, she looked straight into those gray eyes and asked, without greeting, without preamble, "Does Quinlan know I'm here?" Dario looked at her for a moment, and true to the agreement between them that there would be no lies, he answered with a single word. "Yes." "Then why hasn't he done anything?" she asked next. And this time the answer came more slowly, with something darkening at the bottom of the man's eyes. "Because touching you here means touching me, and he isn't reckless enough yet." "But Fiona Donovan, listen to me. A hungry wolf is never patient for long. So from tomorrow on, the first rule of this house is no longer a rule. It's a command for survival. You don't go anywhere alone, not even to the chapel to visit him." Fiona nodded and turned away, but at the threshold, she stopped without looking back and asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue since that afternoon. The question that wasn't in any letter. "Every night at the bar, there was someone sitting in the VIP corner," she said softly. How many nights had he been there? Behind her, the silence stretched for 3 breaths. Then that deep voice sounded, and for the first time, a very fine crack ran through the ice. 182 nights, Dario said. I didn't miss a single one. 3 days later, Fiona asked to go to the Westchester Chapel to visit Grant's ashes, the right granted once a month and written clearly in the contract whose true nature she now understood. And Dario did not stop her, only quietly doubled the number of men who went along, 1 car leading the way, 1 car covering the rear, while she sat in the back seat of the middle car with the head of security, Cole Barrett, a quiet 30-year-old man with a faint scar at his temple and a habit of checking the rearview mirror every 15 seconds. The visit was brief, conducted under the cold witness of the chapel manager. Fiona placed a white daisy before the stone niche behind the bronze door, pressed her palm against the cold slab that stood between her and her husband, and whispered, that she had read as far as the second letter, that she was beginning to understand, that he only needed to wait for her a little longer. Then she wiped her tears before stepping out, because she didn't want anyone in this chapel bearing the Ashcroft name to see her cry one more time. It happened on the way back, along an empty two-lane road skirting the edge of an old industrial area, where chain-link fences and abandoned warehouses passed one after another, beyond the car window. Cole was saying something into the radio about changing the route when Fiona saw it before he did. A white van with no markings surging out from a hidden slope on the right, fast, too fast, and she had time only to scream once before the impact threw the middle car sideways, metal shrieking, the seat belt biting painfully into her collarbone, the world spinning half a turn before stopping in the smell of burning rubber. Everything afterward happened in broken pieces of time. The white van pressed close, its side door tearing open, and two masked figures rushed down. Cole roared one word into the radio, "Run," his hand already locking every door. But the window on Fiona's side spider-webbed under a blow. Gloved fingers reached in to pull the latch, the door flew open, and a hand seized her wrist and dragged her out. And it was in that very second that the part of Fiona forged by 12 years in foster homes and 1,000 night shifts woke up. She did not freeze, she did not beg. She drew up both legs and kicked hard at the open car door, sending it flying back to crush into the man pulling her. He howled and let go. She rolled across the seat, found the small fire extinguisher under the floor, and sprayed it straight through the gap in the door, unleashing a blinding white cloud of powder. Someone cursed. Someone choked. And in the exact confusion she had bought with those 2 reckless seconds, the ground began to tremble. Tires tore against the road from both directions at once. The lead car whipped around and blocked the van's front. The rear car locked tight behind it, and 2 more black cars Fiona had never seen before rose out from the parallel road as if they had always been there, waiting, while Ferrante men poured out without a single shout, moving cleanly and coldly like a machine that had run 1,000 times. There were no gunshots. Fiona heard that more clearly than anything else. No gunshots, only the sound of running feet being stopped. The sound of a body being slammed face down against the hood. The sound of someone's shoulder joint being twisted back with a muffled grunt. The sound of zip ties tightening around wrists, all of it contained within a span of time that Cole would later report in a dry voice as 40 seconds, sir. From impact to full containment was 40 seconds. When Cole helped Fiona out of the car, her legs had gone weak, but she pushed his hand away so she could stand on her own. And she saw that the 2 masked men had already had their coverings torn off, kneeling by the roadside, their faces still white with fire extinguisher powder, while one final black car was gliding toward them with a silence that felt almost eerie. Dario Ferrante stepped out before the car had fully stopped. He didn't run, he didn't need to run. He went straight to Fiona first, stopping 1 step away, his eyes sweeping over her from the seatbelt mark at her collarbone to the scratched knuckles of her hand. And he asked only one question. "Where are you hurt?" His voice still deep, though something underneath it was being held down by the whole force of his will. "I'm fine," she said. "I managed to kick the door myself." For a moment, only a moment, the corner of the man's mouth shifted as if it might become a smile, then vanished the instant he turned toward the 2 men, kneeling on the ground. He did not strike them. He only stood there, and Fiona witnessed something she would never forget. 2 men 1.5 times her size shaking simply because one man stood still and looked at them. "Go tell Amon Quinlan," Dario said, each word slow and clear as if reading a clause from a contract, "that she is under the protection of the Ferrante house. Touching her means declaring war, and next time, his men won't be allowed to kneel on the road and go home." Then he jerked his chin, his men cut the zip ties, threw the 2 attackers into the dented van, and the van fled the scene like a marked animal. On the way back to Southampton, Fiona sat beside Dario in the back seat, neither of them saying a word for the entire 40 miles. She looked at her hands, still trembling, looked at the scrape across her knuckles, and realized that the true fear was only now seeping in, late and icy, like water soaking through cloth. But mixed into that fear was another feeling she couldn't name, a feeling that made her feel guilty for feeling it, that in this world that had just shown its full shape, all teeth and claws, sitting beside the most dangerous man in it, she felt safer than she had anywhere she had ever belonged. The car passed through the iron gates of Southampton as a fine rain began to fall. And just when Fiona thought the ride would end in silence, Dario stared straight ahead and said a sentence that seemed to belong to nothing around them. His voice so quiet it was almost spoken to himself. 8 years ago, it was raining like this too. She turned toward him, but he had already stepped out of the car, leaving the sentence suspended in the sound of the rain, and Fiona remained alone inside for another 10 seconds, her heart beating in a strange rhythm, knowing she had just touched the edge of the second secret. The secret shaped like an 8-year debt not yet repaid. By night, the light drizzle of the afternoon had turned into a downpour, tapping steadily against the stone roof and the tall glass windows of the villa, and Fiona couldn't sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the car door flying open and the gloved hand grabbing her wrist. So sometime after midnight she got up, pulled on a sweater, and went down to the large kitchen, meaning to make herself a cup of tea to warm her body. She walked barefoot, without turning on the hallway lights because she already knew the way, and perhaps that was why he didn't hear her coming. The kitchen was lit only by a single yellow lamp above the sink, and inside that circle of light, Dario Ferrante was sitting on a stool, his shirt unbuttoned and hanging loosely from his left shoulder, his right hand rewrapping a bandage around his left side. Beside him on the stone counter lay an open first aid kit, a roll of gauze, a bottle of antiseptic, and he moved with the practiced skill of a man who had done this for himself far too many times in his life to need anyone's help. The collision that afternoon must have jarred some old wound. Fiona meant to step back and give him that private moment, but just then Dario leaned toward the bottle of antiseptic, the yellow light sliding across his bare side, and Fiona's whole world stopped. There, just beneath the last rib on his left side, was an old scar faded by the years but still clear in its shape. A small curved line like a young moon, crescent-shaped, with tiny dotted scars running along both edges. The traces of stitches that had not been done by a doctor, stitches that had fallen slightly uneven in the middle, at the place where, 8 years earlier, a pair of 19-year-old hands had trembled so badly they had to stop and breathe 3 times before daring to push the needle through again. Fiona knew that scar. She knew it better than she knew any line in her own palm, because her own hands had made it. The teacup she was loosely holding tapped softly against the doorframe, a tiny sound, but in this man's house, no sound was small enough. Dario's head lifted at once, and the two of them looked at each other across the kitchen's half-light and half-darkness. He did not hurry to pull his shirt closed. He only sat still, and in those gray eyes, Fiona read something that made her heart drop into empty air. He was not surprised to be found. He had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "It was you," she said, not as a question, her voice sounding strange even to herself. "The rainy night in Atlantic City. It was you." And memory came crashing back without permission, whole down to every scent and taste, as if 8 years were only a door left ajar. That year Fiona was 19, 7 months removed from leaving nursing school, working the night shift at a shabby little diner at the far end of a street, away from the casino lights of Atlantic City. The kind of place that after 2 o'clock in the morning held only the smell of grease baked onto the grill, the raspy hum of the coffee machine, and the flickering open sign spilling light onto the rain-slick street. It had been raining that night too, just like tonight. She was turning chairs upside down onto tables to mop the floor when the back door, the door used only for taking out trash, burst open, and a young man collapsed inside, with the cold and the smell of rain. His left hand clamped tight against his side, blood seeping between his fingers and darkening the front of his white shirt. His face was deathly pale, but his eyes, those ash-gray eyes, were still wide open and strangely alert, the eyes of a wounded animal still counting every exit. "Don't call the police." That was the first thing he said, his voice breaking. "Please." Fiona stood frozen in the middle of the diner, with the mop in her hand, 19 years old, alone, and every sensible instinct in the world screamed at her to run out the front door. But then the man dropped to his knees on the tile floor, and the part of her that had made her choose nursing, the part that knew too well what pain felt like when no one was beside you, defeated every other reason in a single heartbeat. She locked the diner door, drew the curtains, helped him into the storeroom behind the kitchen, spread several flour sacks for him to lie on, then pulled from her bag the things she always carried, the way other people carried a dream they couldn't quite bury, the tin box of practice needles and thread from nursing school. The wound was on his left side, a long curved tear from a bullet that had grazed him, Deep but luckily not through, and Fiona did everything 2 years of classes had taught her, her hands shaking violently as she disinfected it, shaking even harder as she threaded the needle beneath the weak, yellow storeroom light. She had to stop 3 times midway through to breathe, and that man, cold sweat covering his forehead, did not let out a single groan. He only watched her from beginning to end with those wide gray eyes, as if watching her was the only pain medicine he had. She hid him in that storeroom for 2 days. 2 days in which she went to work as though nothing had happened, secretly bringing him hot soup and bread, changing his bandage every night after the diner closed. For 2 days they barely spoke beyond what was necessary, because he didn't tell and she didn't ask. She only knew from the radio that there had been a hit near the docks that night, and she was smart enough not to want to know more. By the second night, when the stitches had begun to close and he could stand again, she pressed all her tips from the past 2 days into his hand, $87 in small bills, wrinkled and still carrying the greasy smell of the diner. For a cab, she said, and he looked at the money in his hand as if it were some strange object fallen from another planet, then asked the only personal question he had asked in those 2 days. "What's your name?" And that 19-year-old girl, wiser than her years, had shaken her head, pushed him toward the back door, and said the sentence she would forget for 8 years, while the one who heard it carved it into his bones. "Don't come back here. Live a better life." Then the storeroom door closed. The rain swallowed his figure, and Fiona cleaned the storeroom, washed the blood from the towel, and buried the story at the bottom of memory, like burying a night that should never have happened, telling no one, never, not even Grant. Now, in the Southampton kitchen, with the tea cooling in her hand, Fiona looked at the most powerful man in New York, sitting motionless beneath the yellow lamp with the crescent-shaped scar her hands had sewn, and all the scattered pieces of the past weeks, the 8-year debt, the 182 nights in the corner of the bar, the key ring engraved with her name, the sentence about how it had rained like this 8 years ago, all fell into their places at once, soft and dizzying, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "That boy," she heard herself say, her voice only a breath now, "that bleeding boy in my flower storeroom was you." Dario Ferrante slowly pulled the side of his shirt back over the scar, fastening each button as if buying time for both of them, then lifted his eyes to her, and when he spoke, that familiar deep voice did not sound like an order for the first time, nor like a clause in a contract, but like a confession that had waited 8 years to be spoken. "You told me to live a better life," he said. "I've spent 8 years failing at one half of that command, and keeping the other half completely." Dario rose from the stool, motioned for her to follow, and the two of them crossed the dark hallway in silence toward his study, the room where, over the past few weeks, Fiona had stood at the threshold only once. He turned on the desk lamp, pulled a small landscape painting on the wooden wall aside to reveal the door of a safe built into the wall, and turned the lock with movements unusually slow, as though what lay inside was more fragile than all the money and gold in the world. When the safe opened, Fiona saw that there was no inside, no weapons, no papers, only 2 small things lying side by side on a layer of dark velvet. A woman's handkerchief made of white cotton, yellowed to ivory with the years, washed clean and folded neatly into 8. One corner still embroidered with a clumsy little daisy, the same handkerchief that 8 years earlier a waitress had used to press against a stranger's bleeding wound, before she could even find the first aid kit, and beside it, carefully laminated the way people preserve a prestigious diploma, were old, crumpled bills stacked together, $20 bills, $10 bills, $5 bills, limp $1 bills, $87 in all, every bill intact, the very same bills still carrying the diner grease smell that she had pressed into his hand by the back door of the storeroom. Fiona reached out and touched the laminated plastic, and tears fell before she even understood why she was crying. 8 years, she said. "You kept it for 8 years. You are the richest man in this city. Why would you keep $87? Dario looked at the 2 things in the safe for a long time before answering, and when he spoke, his voice dropped to a register she had never heard before. "This isn't $87, he said. "This is everything a girl who had nothing owned, given to a kid who was worth nothing. I've held a great deal of money in my life, Fiona. Millions have passed through my hands like water, but not a single dollar of it was ever given without asking for something back. Only this money was. He half closed the safe door as if closing a page of scripture. A man doesn't spend the only thing that ever proved to him that kindness is real. Then why didn't you come back? The question broke out of Fiona almost like an accusation. 8 years. You knew where I was. You have an army that can find anyone. Why did you disappear? Dario turned back to look at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw that man struggling to choose his words. You told me 2 things, he said. Don't come back, and live a better life. I sat on the bus leaving Atlantic City that night and understood something. That for someone like me, born at the bottom of the underworld, climbing upward on steps you shouldn't know the substance of, the only way to live better toward you was to never let my shadow fall across your life. My world has no place for someone like you, Fiona. Anyone who stands beside me becomes a target. So I chose the only decent thing I was capable of doing. I stayed in the dark, and I watched over you from there. Watched over me, she repeated, and a cold intuition ran down her spine. From there means since when? Since before you met your husband, Dario answered, without evasion, exactly as their agreement allowed no lies. My people told me when you left Atlantic City, told me when you came to New York, told me which diner in Brooklyn you worked at. I didn't interfere in your life. I only needed to know you were safe. Then he stopped, walked to the window and looked out into the rain, his back turned to her, and continued in the voice of a man stepping into the hardest part of a confession. Until one evening 15 months ago, when a young man came to one of my offices, empty-handed, no guards, no lawyer, introduced himself as Grant Ashcroft, and said one sentence to the man at the door that was enough to get him brought in to see me. Tell Mr. Ferrante I've come because of the girl from the Atlantic City diner. Fiona felt her legs searching for the edge of the leather chair so she could sit down. My husband, she whispered. My husband knew. He knew. Dario nodded, still looking at the rain. You never told him about that night, did you? No, of course not. But Grant Ashcroft was an analyst, and he was a husband who looked at his wife more closely than you realized. He told me that once, while moving, he found a half-used roll of medical suture thread in your sewing kit, and an old newspaper clipping about the doc killing in Atlantic City. He didn't ask you. He went looking, and a man like him, once he went looking, found what he was looking for. He traced it back to me not to question his wife's past, but because by then he had just discovered his family's books. He knew he had seen something that could get him killed, and he went in search of the only man in the world strong enough to stand against Eamon Quinlan and indebted to his wife for a life. Dario turned back, and those gray eyes now held something Fiona had never seen there before. Respect for a man who was gone. I've met many brave men, he said. Men who were brave because they had guns, money, and a way out. Your husband walked into my office with nothing but his love for you. He sat down across from me, a young accountant in front of the man the whole city feared, and he bargained with me as if bargaining over a contract. He said, I know you owe my wife. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you for only one thing. If I don't make it home in time, don't let her face life alone. The room sank into the sound of the rain. Fiona sat motionless on the edge of the chair, both hands covering her face, and she cried. Not the shattered sobbing of the morning she had been thrown out, not the silent crying inside the car in Red Hook, but another kind of tears altogether, hot and full, spilling from the deepest place, because she had just seen the whole shape of something too large to bear. For 8 years, not one day had she truly been as alone as she had believed. There had been one man standing in the dark, keeping watch so she could remain safe, because she had once given him $87 and a command. And there had been another man who knew everything, knew even the secret she had never told, knew even that death was coming for him, yet still silently made coffee every morning, silently went to meet a Mafia boss to bargain for his wife's future, silently carried the whole sky that was about to collapse so she could live through a few more carefree final days. They never left me alone, she said, through her fingers. Neither of them did. Dario did not come closer, did not touch her. He only stood still beside the window, keeping the exact distance of a promise, and said the final sentence of that night, his voice deep as the rain outside. He loved you with a love even I had to bow my head before, Fiona, so understand this correctly. I brought you here not to replace anyone. I'm here to keep what remains of a promise, and to repay a debt that for 8 years I never dared believe I would have the chance to repay. 2 days after that rainy night, when her heart had grown quiet enough to bear one more layer of truth, Fiona returned to the reading room, on a morning of pale sunlight, and opened envelope number 3, the letter in which Grant had written in the very first line that this one would be different from the first 2, my love. In the first 2 letters, I told you about the people who did evil things. In this one, I have to confess to you the good things I secretly did behind your back, and I hope that after you finish reading, you'll forgive me for that secrecy. Do you remember the autumn of our 2nd year of marriage? Grant wrote, that evening, when you sat at the kitchen table with the tuition debt letter from the community college. The debt left from the nursing program you had to abandon. You thought I didn't see you fold the letter and tuck it into the bottom of your sewing tin, but I saw. I saw the way you smoothed it flat before putting it away, the way someone strokes the memorial photograph of a dream. 3 months later, you received a notice saying that the debt had been cleared through an assistance program for students in hardship. You were happy for an entire week. You told me, see, miracles still exist in this world. I nodded and felt like the happiest liar in New York. There was no program, my love. There was only a husband who took his first year-end bonus and used it to pay off the debt on his wife's dream, because I couldn't bear the thought of that dream lying at the bottom of your sewing tin for even one more day, and I kept it secret because I knew your pride would make you refuse. Some gifts can only be given in silence. Fiona had to set the letter down and bury her face in both hands for a long while, remembering that exact evening, the pot of pasta on the stove, Grant whistling in the bathroom as if he had not noticed a thing, and it turned out he had seen everything and saved her dream without accepting even one word of thanks. But the letter did not stop there. The second thing I have to confess, Grant continued, and this is important, so read carefully. 1 year before I wrote this letter, as soon as I understood what my family's books contained and understood how much my life was worth in that game, I bought a life insurance policy with Meridian Life. The only beneficiary is Fiona Donovan, with enough value that you should never have to serve anyone again in your life. I had 1 copy of the paperwork stored at Mr. Shaw's office, but here is what I need to warn you about. When the insurance company pays out, it will send notice to my residential address, which means the address controlled by my family. If no one has ever mentioned this policy to you, then understand that someone received that notice on your behalf and stayed silent. Fiona sat upright, blood rushing hard at both temples. 6 months, she had lived for 6 months on tips, had eaten sandwiches split in half with Cassie, had slept in her car with $43 in her wallet. While somewhere there was money her husband had set aside for her, bought with his own intuition that death was coming, and the people who carried the Ashcroft name had received the notice, had known, and had swallowed that silence whole just as they had swallowed everything else. And the third thing, Grant wrote, his handwriting sharpening in this passage as though another man had taken over the pen. If they force you to sign any paperwork in the name of debts of mine, then hold this letter as witness. I, Grant Ashcroft, have not borrowed a single cent from my family since the day they cast me out. I swear it on our love. Any debt papers bearing my name that appear after my death are fabricated, and you must look closely at the signatures on those papers. Anyone who forges the signature of a dead man will always leave behind the fingerprints of the living. In the steel box, beneath the bottom lining, there is a separate envelope where I placed a few old financial documents bearing my real signature and the signatures of others in the family. You will need them for comparison. Fiona did as he instructed, lifted the felt lining from the bottom of the steel box, found the extra envelope, and spread the papers across the table beneath the sunlight. She placed the copy of the debt contract Patricia had once forced her to sign beside the old signatures, and she didn't need a handwriting expert to see what struck her immediately. The signature bearing Grant's name on the acknowledgement of debt was rounded in perfectly, even in a lifeless way, lacking the rushed left-leaning stroke she had seen 1,000 times on diner napkins, while at the lower corner of the debt paper, where the witness and family representative line appeared, there was a florid, self-satisfied signature she recognized at once because she had seen it on the only Christmas card the Ashcroft family had ever sent, the signature of Preston Ashcroft. She sat for a very long time before those papers, and something inside her changed completely, quietly but beyond reversal, like water turning into ice. She realized the tears on her cheeks had dried without her knowing when, and what remained in her chest was no longer pain, but a cold, steady clarity. They thought she was prey. They had forgotten that prey that survives long enough learns the ways of the hunter. She gathered every page with hands that did not tremble, arranged them in order, clipped them carefully together the way she had once learned to organize medical files, then went to find Dario and Aldo, placed the stack of papers on the desk in the study, and said in the voice of someone who had just crossed through a door with no path back, "I don't want to hide anymore. I want to reclaim my husband's ashes through the law, restore his honor, and make every person who signed this paper pay the price. Tell me where to begin." Aldo looked at the papers, then looked at her, and for the first time that old advisor truly smiled. "Miss Donovan," he said, "we begin with Mr. Shaw, and we begin tomorrow." That night, when every plan had been laid out and Aldo had withdrawn, Fiona stood on the porch looking out at the dark sea. Dario brought her a cup of chamomile tea, set it on the railing beside her, and said nothing. And for one very thin moment, as they both looked toward the waves hidden in the darkness, his hand rested on the railing only a handspan from hers, and Fiona felt that handspan of distance more clearly than any distance in the world. She felt it waiting for her, patient and asking nothing, only waiting. And precisely because it asked nothing, it became frightening. She looked down at the steaming cup of tea, then drew her hand back from the railing, stepped half a pace away, and said the words that had to be said, her voice soft but every word distinct as a vow. "Dario, I'm more grateful to you than you think, and I'm not blind. I can feel what's growing here, between the two of us, but please understand, I haven't scattered my husband's ashes yet. He's still lying behind a bronze door I haven't been able to open. I don't have the right to be happy, not yet." Dario did not move, did not turn toward her, only gave a slight nod once, and when he answered, that deep voice was so calm she almost failed to recognize the weight beneath it. "I waited 8 years just to repay a debt, Fiona Donovan," he said. "Do you think I don't know how to wait? Go reclaim your person first. I'll be here." And some lighthouse far offshore swept a slow band of light across the night, like an old promise waking again. Mr. Shaw began work the very next morning, and it turned out that the calm old lawyer, when he struck, did so with the precision of a stitch. He sent the Ashcroft family's law office a file containing 3 things: a copy of the Meridian life insurance policy naming Fiona Donovan as the beneficiary, together with proof that the company had sent payment notice to the Westchester address 5 months earlier, a preliminary conclusion from a handwriting expert regarding the debt acknowledgement, and an emergency petition to family court requesting that the labor contract signed under coercion be voided and custody of the remains be transferred. Along with a verbal message he asked to have delivered word for word. "My client is prepared to bring all of this into an open court hearing, along with the press." The Ashcroft family resisted for exactly 9 days. 9 days during which calls from their lawyers slowly shifted from threats to bargaining, then to pleading for a private settlement, and on the 10th day, they surrendered unconditionally before the thing they feared more than the law, light. The handover took place on a cloudy Thursday morning at the Westchester Chapel, under the witness of Mr. Shaw, a court officer, and the recording camera from the law office. Fiona walked through that gate for the last time in her life, not looking at Patricia standing rigid as a wax figure in the corner of the hall, not looking at Richard staring down at the stone floor. She looked only at the bronze door being opened, and when the chapel manager placed the cold bronze urn into her hands, heavier than she had imagined it would be, Fiona's knees gave way for one beat, and she had to use all her will to straighten again. 6 months, 12 hours every night, 1,000 bowed heads, all exchanged for the moment when she could hold against her chest what remained of the person she loved. She held the urn as if holding a sleeping child, bent her head, and whispered something no one else could hear, then turned and walked out, while the entire chapel behind her fell silent, and not one person dared open their mouth. She chose the following Sunday to scatter the ashes, and she said only one sentence to Dario. "I need to go to Montauk. He asked me to meet him there." The convoy left Southampton early, driving toward the easternmost end of the island, where land gradually gave way and sky and sea began, and when the white lighthouse appeared beyond the final bend, towering and silent exactly as it had in the wedding photograph, rain began to fall, a small, patient rain, the kind that had no intention of stopping. Fiona walked alone to the rocky point below the lighthouse, holding the bronze urn in her arms, the sea wind tossing her hair and the rain slowly soaking through the shoulders of her coat. She stood exactly where, 8 years earlier, The two of them had spread a blanket and shared a bottle of cheap wine, where Grant had pointed up at the light and said that if they ever got lost from each other, they would meet here again. "I'm here," she said to the urn, her voice torn apart by the wind. "I'm late, but I'm here." Then she took out her phone, the old phone that still had the same from those days, opened the saved voicemail folder, and found the message she had seen appear on that April night, but had only been able to hear the first 3 seconds of before cutting it off. Because the police were calling on the other line, the message she had not once had the courage to play again for 6 months. It had been recorded at 9:47 in the evening, and the State Patrol report recorded the time of the crash as 9:49. 2 minutes. She pressed play and held the phone to her ear beneath the rain. The steady sound of the car engine hummed in the background, and then Grant's voice came through, so alive it was cruel, warm and a little hurried the way it always was when he called from the car. "Hi, my love, it's me. The Taconic is empty tonight. I should be home in about an hour. Don't wait dinner for me." Actually, he paused for a second. "Maybe wait for me a little. I need to tell you something important tonight. I've thought about it for a long time, and I've decided. Enough is enough. We're not hiding anymore, sweetheart." Then came the sound of his soft laugh, that slightly crooked laugh of his. "All right, I'm hanging up now. You'll scold me again for talking on the phone while driving. Oh, and Fiona, let me say this before I come in to eat. I love you. I love you more than everything my family thinks you don't deserve. See you in 30 minutes. Beep." The message ended. "See you in 30 minutes. Fiona stood motionless for a very long time, rain streaming down her face, mingling with something saltier than rain. She listened again, just to hear him laugh, then slipped the phone into the innermost pocket of her coat, close to her heart, opened the lid of the bronze urn with drenched hands, and spoke the final words of a marriage, not ornate words, only the words that needed to be said. "You didn't break your promise. I'm the one who came late. You told me to meet you at the lighthouse, so here we are. We've found each other. Stay here with the wind and the sea. This place is bright. The light never goes out. You don't have to lie behind their bronze door for another night. And the important thing you didn't have time to tell me." She drew a long breath full of rain and wind. "I know now. I read your letters. I'll finish it for you. I promise." Then she tilted the urn toward the sea, and the Atlantic wind received Grant Ashcroft, carried him low across the rocks, across the white sea foam, scattering him into the space between the lighthouse and the horizon, returning him to the freedom he had paid so dearly his whole life to choose. Fiona stood there until the urn was weightless in her hands, until she could no longer tell rain from tears, and when she finally turned around, she saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. Exactly 20 paces away, Dario Ferrante stood in the rain, bareheaded, his black suit soaked and clinging to his shoulders, the neatly folded umbrella propped beside his foot like something he had brought with him, and then decided he had no right to use. He had stood there that way from the beginning, not taking a single step closer, not speaking a single word, only sharing the rain with her, like a guard sharing the same watch with a grief that was not his own. And when their eyes met through the rain, he said nothing at all. He only bowed his head once, deep and slow, toward the sea where Grant had just vanished, the bow of one man before another man, and Fiona understood that on this rocky point, she had not been the only one saying goodbye. Someone else had just silently seen off the only person in the world who had ever made him bow his head in respect. The friend who had never had time to become a friend. The man who had walked into the tiger's den empty-handed, only to bargain for a future he knew he would not be part of. 2 weeks after the day the ashes were scattered, the first tremors began running through the Ashcroft empire, and Fiona learned of them not through the newspapers, but through the brief reports Aldo placed on the breakfast table each morning. The restaurant chain in central Manhattan abruptly closed 2 locations under the excuse of renovations. A longtime bank quietly withdrew from a refinancing agreement. Suppliers began demanding advance payment in cash, and most frightening of all to those inside the circle, men in suits noticeably cheaper than anything worn by the finance world started appearing at Ashcroft restaurants after closing hours, sitting for a very long time, ordering nothing, the kind of sitting done by creditors who had come to take inventory of assets. Alongside all of that, Mr. Shaw received word from old contacts that at least 2 subpoenas from a federal grand jury had been sent to former accountants of the group, that some very large and very slow machine of the federal government had begun to turn. "The ship is sinking," Aldo remarked in the flat tone of a man who had seen this scene many times in his life, "and rats always call before the water reaches the deck." He was right down to the day. That weekend, Fiona's phone lit up with a name she had thought she had erased, and when she answered, Patricia Ashcroft's voice poured into her ear, so sweet and soft it was almost unrecognizable. "My child," that voice said, "I know I no longer have the right to call you that. I'm only asking you for one dinner. Let this family sit down together once. There are misunderstandings that need to be healed before it's too late. I reserved a table at Beaumont on Friday night. Just you and me, I promise." Fiona looked out the reading room window for a long while. She knew exactly what this was. Dario knew too, and when she told him she was going, he said only one sentence: "My people will sit at the 3 tables around you." Aldo added the second sentence: "Miss Donovan. Remember this, when someone invites you to dinner at Beaumont, the main course is never on the menu." On Friday night, Fiona walked into Beaumont in a simple black dress, and from the doorway she saw that the promise of "just you and me" was worth exactly as much as every other promise Patricia had ever made. At the round table in the most discreet corner sat all 4 of them: Patricia in pale gray silk, the color of manufactured sincerity; Richard with a face far more hollow than it had been at Southampton; Preston with the gold watch now missing from his wrist; and Brooke sitting tucked at the edge as though trying to take up as little space as possible. Fiona stopped for 1 second at the entrance, considering turning away, then decided to walk over, because there are certain performances one needs to watch to the end, so one never has to buy a ticket again. The dinner opened with 15 minutes of talk about the weather and strained questions about her health. Appetizers were served, and no one touched a fork, and Fiona only sat quietly, waiting until Patricia set down her water glass, took a breath, and stepped into the leading role of the performance. "My child, this family is going through a temporary difficult period. Bad people are surrounding us from every side. Partners have turned their backs, banks have betrayed us, even people this family has fed for 20 years have turned against us." Richard continued in the hoarse voice of a man who had lost sleep for weeks. "The company needs an urgent capital injection to get through this quarter. $20 million, my dear. For ordinary people, that's a fortune, but with your current connections—" He let the sentence trail off and looked at her with what he must have believed was fatherly affection, while Preston finished it with the only logic he knew. "Anyway, you're still known as Grant's wife. The Ashcroft assets will eventually include a nominal share for you too. Saving the company means saving your own property. This is an investment, not a handout." Fiona sat and listened to everything, from beginning to end, without interrupting once. And through nearly an hour she counted exactly how many times the word sorry appeared in their story. Not once. No one mentioned that October morning. No one mentioned the contract or the bar in Red Hook. No one mentioned the insurance notice they had swallowed. No one mentioned 6 months. They spoke of money as if nothing had ever existed between them and her except money. And perhaps, she thought, for them nothing else ever truly had. When Richard ended with the question the entire table had been waiting for, "So what do you think? Family is still family, isn't it?" Fiona placed both hands on the table, straightened her back, and answered in a voice so calm it surprised even her. "This is what I think," she said. "I've sat here for an hour listening to all of you describe what it feels like to be cornered, abandoned, turned away from in the most difficult moment. And I understand that feeling, truly. I understand it better than everyone sitting at this table combined, because I know very well what it feels like to drown while the whole family stands and watches." She let that sentence lie between them like a mirror, and in the long silence that followed, she looked at each face one by one. No one dared meet her eyes for more than 2 seconds. "The difference is," she continued, still without raising her voice, "back then I asked all of you for something that wasn't worth a single cent, a place to sleep for one night, one question asking whether I was all right, or simply that no one laugh when I knelt down to pick up my things. Today you're asking me for $20 million, and what makes me saddest isn't the number, but the fact that even when you need me this badly, no one in this family has enough strength to say the 2 words "I'm sorry" before talking about money." She stood, opened her purse, took out enough bills to pay for the appetizer she had not touched and the tip for the server, and placed them neatly beside the plate, because there were some habits of a waitress she would keep for the rest of her life. "I can't help you," she said. "Not because I hate you. If I hated you, I would have stayed to watch you beg. I won't help because I learned something this very family taught me, that saving people who are willing to push you under isn't kindness, it is slow suicide. I hope you all make it through this winter." Then she turned and walked straight to the door, back straight, steps even, not looking back at the 4 statues turning to stone around the round table. And only when she sat in the car and closed the door did she allow herself one long tremor, not from sadness, but because she had just set down a weight she had carried on her shoulders for far too long. The car had gone 3 blocks from Beaumont when her phone vibrated. The screen showed the name Cassie Malone, and the moment Fiona answered, she knew something was wrong, because Cassie did not say hello, did not make a joke. Her red-haired friend's voice broke into pieces between gasping breaths, like someone who had just been running. "Fiona, listen to me. Don't ask questions. Tonight the old boss's men came to the bar. They broke open your old locker and tore through everything. I hid in the storeroom and heard them. They found an old business card of lawyer Everett Shaw tucked inside your uniform pocket, with your husband Grant's handwriting on the back. They realized the lawyer has been helping you, called someone to report it, and I heard them saying they are tracking down your safe deposit box." Cassie's call turned the car into a mobile command room. Fiona repeated every word to Dario over the phone, and his answer came within 10 seconds, short as a knife stroke. The real safe deposit box was never at the address on that receipt. Grant was more careful than everyone imagined. That paper only leads to a transfer branch. Everything important has been in the Southampton reading room from the first day. But the fact that Quinlan has traced it that far means he has run out of patience. "We're out of time. Come home now. Tonight we open everything that's left." And so, sometime past midnight that night, in the reading room with the curtains drawn tight, 3 people sat around the green baize-covered table, Fiona, Dario, and Aldo, and before them lay an offline computer, and the small black hard drive Mr. Shaw had taken from the steel box according to the instructions in letter number 5, Grant's shortest letter, containing only a few lines. "My love, this is the final part. The password is the date we met, joined with the name of the lighthouse. I'm sorry for what you're about to see, and I'm asking you to remember one thing when you reach the last file. Don't let it turn you into them." Fiona typed the password with cold fingers. The hard drive opened like a grave being exhumed, hundreds of folders arranged by year, 20 years of bank statements, phantom contracts, photographs of auxiliary ledgers, cross-reference tables tracking money flows between Ashcroft restaurants and Eamon Quinlan's shell companies, all painstakingly marked by Grant in 3 colors, and they followed that folder tree for nearly 2 hours until they reached the final folder, named with just one word, Taconic. Inside were only 3 files. The first was a screenshot collection of messages Grant had backed up from his own phone during his final weeks. The messages he had sent to his mother, the only person in the family with whom he had maintained minimal contact, and Fiona read her husband's own words. "Mom, I need to talk to the whole family. I've seen the books. I'm giving everyone a chance to settle this with the law before I'm forced to do what has to be done. Tuesday night I'll drive up to Westchester." And the reply from Patricia's number, neat and warm in a horrifying way when placed beside everything that happened afterward. "All right, I'll prepare dinner. Take the Taconic. It'll be faster, dear. That stretch is empty at this hour." The second file was a recording Grant had made with a recorder hidden in his jacket pocket during his final visit to the Westchester mansion, 11 days before he died, and the 3 of them sat as still as stone, listening to the voices of the living accuse themselves. Richard's voice came first, trembling and low. "Patricia, I'm begging you, he's my son. Let him go. If he wants to testify, then I'll go to prison. I'm old. I can take all of it." And then Patricia's voice, not raised, not breaking, calm as if she were approving a dinner menu. "You are always weak exactly when you're not allowed to be weak. If you take all of it, whom do you save? Preston has signed nearly every document for the past 10 years. He rots in prison. Brooke becomes the daughter of a criminal family. 3 generations of the Ashcroft name become a joke. And have you forgotten what happened in Providence? I haven't kept that file for 30 years as decoration. A family that wants to survive has to know how to cut away the gangrene, even when the gangrene carries its own name. You can't stop me. You never could." The third file was something Grant had added only 8 days before his death. Photographs of a call log extracted from the mansion's phone bill, which he still had access to because of an old oversight, showing that on that fateful Tuesday afternoon, exactly 40 minutes after the message telling him to take the Taconic, because it would be faster, there had been a 3-minute call from the Westchester Mansion's landline to a prepaid cell number, and beneath it Grant had written a note in handwriting that had lost all its slant. This number appears in Quinlan's internal records as an enforcement crew line. If this number receives my route, then whoever reads this file understands who made the call. The room was so silent Fiona could hear the clock downstairs. She sat motionless before the screen, looking at the 3 pieces lying beside one another, the message giving directions, the recording, the call 40 minutes later. 3 pieces fitting together into a shape that could no longer be denied, and that shape wore the face of the woman with the pearl necklace. The woman who had dragged Fiona by the hair across the stone foyer, the woman who had forced her to trade a year of her life for an urn, the urn of the son whom she herself had guided death toward. It wasn't Quinlan who began it. It wasn't Preston. It was his mother. Fiona heard something break very softly somewhere inside her. She shot to her feet, knocking over the chair, took 3 steps toward the window, then stopped in the middle of the room like someone who had forgotten every direction, both arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, her body bending forward, and a dry sob tore out of her, without tears, because this kind of pain had gone beyond the layer where tears existed. She used his ashes as a condition against me, she said, her voice twisting out of shape. She made me pay a debt to bring home the thing her own hands had created. Dario, she attended his funeral. She wore black, she accepted condolence flowers, and when she looked up, she saw that the most frightening thing in that night was not on the computer screen. It was on Dario Ferrante's face. Every line of that face remained motionless, but his gray eyes had changed to a shade she had never seen before. Not even on the morning after the night in the outbuilding. He stood without a sound, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and said to Aldo in a gently chilling voice, like thin ice laid over an abyss, "Prepare the cars. Call Team 1. Tonight I want to speak with Mrs. Ashcroft and Aldo." The man who had served 2 generations of the Ferrante family only bowed his head to receive the order without a second of hesitation. It was at that very moment that Fiona rushed forward, without time to think. She blocked the space between Dario and the door, both hands closing around his wrist, the first touch between them since the day they had met, and beneath her fingers she felt an entire earthquake being restrained by will. "No," she said, looking straight up into those gray eyes. "No killing." Dario looked down at her, his voice still frighteningly gentle. "You watched the same thing I did. That woman doesn't belong under the jurisdiction of human courts." "Yes," she tightened her grip. "That's exactly why it has to be the court. Listen to me. Grant died because of the world of guns and anonymous calls. If you deal with her by the rules of that world, then that world wins. She gets to die as a mystery. The Ashcroft name stays intact inside the fog, and you," she drew a hard breath, her voice lowering, "you become the exact thing I told you not to become 8 years ago. And I lose the last person I have left, Dario. My husband wrote in his letter, 'Don't let it turn you into them.' That sentence was meant for you, too. We end this with the law, in public, in broad daylight, so all of New York can see her being led away. That's what frightens people like them most, not a bullet, but light." The room held its breath. Aldo stood motionless by the door, and for a span that seemed as long as a lifetime, Fiona watched the struggle take place inside those gray eyes, between 20 years of underworld instinct and an 8-year-old command, until the hand that had been hard as steel beneath her grip slowly loosened. Dario closed his eyes for 1 second, and when he opened them, the ice had returned to its place, but beneath it was a decision. "Call Shaw," he told Aldo, his voice once again the voice of contracts. "Tell him to activate contact with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the anti-money laundering team, the agent he trusts. What's her name?" Aldo opened his small notebook. "Madam Dana Whitfield." "Sir, good," Dario said. Then he looked down at Fiona, whose hand still had not left his wrist, and the final sentence of that long night he spoke to her alone, so softly Aldo couldn't hear. "You just saved a life, Fiona Donovan. And I'm not sure it was hers." The meeting with Special Agent Dana Whitfield was arranged by Mr. Shaw over 4 days, a woman in her 40s with the eyes of someone who had read too many files to still be surprised by the human species. She listened for 3 hours, reviewed 20 minutes of sample extracts, then said simply, "This is enough to shut down both names in the file. I need the original hard drive with the chain of evidence intact, this Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning, at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. And from this moment on, assume every wall has ears, because somewhere inside the system, Quinlan has ears too." She was bitterly right. On Wednesday night, Aldo walked into the study with a face grayer than usual. "Sir, our people on Quinlan's side have reported back. He knows the day, he knows the hour, he knows the route. He has placed men all the way from Southampton to the bridge. He doesn't intend to let that hard drive survive until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." A thick silence sank over the room, then Dario stood, went to the Long Island map spread across the table, and said in the voice of a man who had already calculated the game, "Then give him what he wants to see. He is waiting for a convoy at dawn. He'll get a convoy. 3 armored cars will take the exact route he knows, headlights blazing like a procession, while the real hard drive will be in Cole Barrett's jacket pocket, riding in an old pickup carrying gardening supplies, leaving through the back gate at 4 o'clock in the morning, by the local roads with Mr. Shaw. No one ambushes a truck full of potting soil." Aldo nodded, asking only one question, then who sits in the decoy convoy, and the answer made the whole room go dead. "I do," Dario said. "Quinlan's people can recognize me through a car window by the way I sit. A decoy convoy without me is a dead decoy. He'll smell it out in 3 minutes and turn to hunt the real vehicle." "Sir," Aldo's voice went hoarse, "for 20 years the first rule of survival in this house was set by you yourself. The head never turns himself into a target." "I know," Dario answered, "and tonight I break it, because this is no longer business. This is a promise to a dead man." Fiona stopped him in the hallway after all the orders had been given. "You don't have to do this." Her voice stretched tight as a wire. "We can delay, we can find another way." "We can," he nodded, "and every day we delay is one more day for Quinlan, to find Cassie, to find Mr. Shaw, to find anyone who has ever stood near you. I survived 20 years by never taking risks. Allow me one time to use this life for something worthy." She wanted to say more, but he had already turned away, and she understood there are decisions no one can change, only stay awake beside. At 3:45 in the morning, fog lay thick over the ground in Southampton, and Fiona stood at the second-floor window looking down into the courtyard, where 2 convoys were preparing to leave in opposite directions, the old pickup vanishing through the back gate without lights, while 3 black cars lined up before the front gate, and before stepping into the middle car, Dario lifted his eyes to the exact window where she stood, not waving, not nodding, only looking. 3 seconds, then the car door closed. Aldo remained at the villa as the communication center, and Fiona sat beside him from that moment on, before the bank of radios, listening to the game unfold through sound. 4:10, gardening vehicle past the first toll point, clean. 4:22, main convoy entering the highway, 2 tails holding distance. 4:40, Cole's voice even, past midpoint rendezvous, clean, 60 minutes out. 5 minutes to 5, the decoy team leader's voice tightened by 1 degree. 3 more cars blocking the exit ahead. "They're forcing us into the construction stretch." And Fiona heard, through the static of the radio, the world on that side break open. The long shriek of tires, metal grinding against metal, shouts to change formation. Then a series of sharp explosions that took her 1 second to understand, were bullets striking bulletproof glass, distant and dry like fireworks from hell. "Hold formation." Dario's voice rose through the chaos, impossibly calm. "Block for me for 4 more minutes. The gardening vehicle needs 4 more minutes to cross the bridge." 1 minute to 5, Cole's voice, "Cross the bridge, sir," entering Manhattan. And just as the room in Southampton released its breath, the other radio cut hard, another burst of shots, someone shouting, "Sir is hit, glass breach at the B pillar." Then Dario's voice, still that voice but thinned by 1 layer, like a man speaking through his teeth, "I'm fine. Withdraw by route 2. Repeat." No one turns back, and Fiona sprang to her feet, her hand gripping the edge of the table, listening to that man's breathing over the radio waves, each breath short and forced, hearing Aldo call the private doctor in urgent Italian, and for the longest 20 minutes of her life, she no longer prayed for the hard drive. She only counted each rasping breath through the static. At 6:10, the black car riddled with bullet marks returned to the Southampton gate in the gray dawn. Fiona ran down into the courtyard barefoot over the cold gravel, and men helped Dario out of the car, his white shirt darkly soaked along his left side. The left side, that same place. He was still standing on his own, leaning against the car door, and when he saw her running toward him, the man who had just gone through an ambush said only one sentence, managing half of a pale smile. "The hard drive made it." Whitfield confirmed it. "We won." Then his knees gave way, and Fiona managed to slide her shoulder beneath him before he hit the ground, shouting for Aldo, shouting for the doctor, while her hand pressed hard against the wound on that left side, the same place where, 8 years earlier, this very hand had once pressed down, and warm blood seeped through her fingers as if time had just folded over itself into one. The bullet had passed through a gap at the edge of the soft body armor, cutting a line along his left side without touching any organs. The Ferrante family's private doctor concluded after treating the deepest part of the wound, but he still had 2 other emergency cases from the decoy convoy waiting in the outbuilding, so when someone was needed to close the outermost stitches, Fiona was already standing beside the table with sterile gloves on. "Let me," she said, and no one in that room dared argue. They were in the safe room beneath the villa, with soundproof walls and white lights, Dario half lying, half sitting on the medical bed, awake because he had refused the second dose of sedative, and Fiona sat down beside his left side with the tray of medical needles and thread, in the exact position her body had remembered for 8 years. Her hand trembled as she threaded the needle, not because she didn't know how to do it, but because she knew far too well, because of the smell of antiseptic, because the old crescent scar lay right beside the new wound like 2 lines written by the same hand 8 years apart. She had to stop and breathe 3 times, exactly as the 19-year-old girl in the flower storeroom once had. And when the first stitch passed through, the man on the bed did not make a sound. He only watched her from the beginning, as he had 8 years earlier, as if watching her was the only pain medicine he needed. She had reached the 4th stitch when he spoke, his voice still thin from blood loss, but the corner of his mouth already curving upward. "This time," he said, "do I get to ask your name?" Fiona let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, tears dropping onto the back of her gloved hand. "Idiot," she said, her hand still not slipping by even a fraction. "You've known my name for 8 years, you even engraved it on the keys to your house." "I know," he answered, his eyes never leaving her face, "but I still want to hear you say it yourself, once, through no one else." She tied the final knot, cut the thread, removed the gloves, then looked straight into those waiting gray eyes. "Fiona," she said softly. "Fiona Donovan." Then she placed her hand over his willingly for the first time, and they sat still that way in the white room, neither of them saying anything more, because 8 years had already said enough. In the days that followed, reckoning came for the remaining people exactly the way Fiona had chosen, publicly, in daylight, under the light. The noon news on Monday showed Eamon Quinlan being escorted out of an office building in Brooklyn, in figure-8 handcuffs. The organized crime task force reading an arrest warrant under federal racketeering law, with dozens of simultaneous searches taking place from the docks to the Gilded Anchor, where Casey stood among the staff on the sidewalk watching police carry box after box of records out to the vehicles. On Tuesday afternoon, Preston Ashcroft was arrested in the parking lot of the corporate headquarters on charges of money laundering and document forgery, and the television cameras moved in close on the wrist that no longer wore a gold watch as steel cuffs locked around it. But Fiona only truly went still before the screen on Thursday night, when the live broadcast showed footage from the hotel ballroom where the annual charity gala of the Ashcroft Family Foundation was being held. Patricia stood on the stage in an ivory evening gown, her familiar pearl necklace at her throat, halfway through a speech about the responsibility privileged families had to the community, when 4 federal agents led by Dana Whitfield walked straight between the banquet tables, stepped onto the stage, and in front of 300 guests and every camera of New York high society, read the warrant for her arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit money laundering and conspiracy to commit murder. The victim, Grant Ashcroft. The sound of steel cuffs locking shut rang through the microphone that was still on. The entire ballroom froze, then broke open into the sound of cameras, and Patricia Ashcroft was led away through the very people she had spent her life performing for, her back still straight but her face, for the first time in public, unable to hold any mask at all. Fiona turned off the screen before the broadcast ended. She sat for a very long time in the dark living room, waiting for the feeling of victory to come, but it did not come. What rose inside her chest was only a vast emptiness and a sorrowful tenderness, not for the people who had just been cuffed, but for the man who had not lived to see the truth called by its right name. Justice had finished its work, she thought, but justice could not bring anyone back. Slow footsteps sounded behind her. Dario, one hand still pressed lightly against his side, came and sat at the far end of the sofa. Saying nothing, only being there, and Fiona looked out into the darkness beyond the window, where the waves kept moving with their steady sound, and whispered, not to him, but to the man somewhere out in the sea wind, "It's done, my love. I finished it for you." Many weeks passed, and winter truly set foot in Southampton. The first snowstorms covered the lawn that sloped down toward the sea in white. The wound along Dario's side closed into a new scar, running parallel to the old one. The news about the Ashcroft and Quinlan case gradually moved from the front page to the inside pages. Preston pleaded guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. Patricia was held pending trial without bail. After the court determined she was a flight risk, the restaurant empire's assets were frozen and put up for sale piece by piece. And the name that had once made New York high society step carefully was now mentioned only as a cautionary tale. And in the middle of those first quiet days, on an afternoon when snow was falling lightly, the security system reported that a man was standing at the gate, without an appointment, without a lawyer, without a luxury car, only a taxi that had already turned around and left. And when Fiona looked at the screen, it took her several seconds to recognize Richard Ashcroft. He seemed to have aged 10 years in only a few weeks, his overcoat hanging loose on his body, his hair completely white, standing hunched in the snow with both hands empty. She let him in, not because her heart had softened, but because she realized she was no longer afraid of anything this man might say. They sat facing each other in the living room, the cup of hot tea before Richard slowly cooling untouched, and he did not circle around the subject, perhaps because he had nothing left to preserve by circling. "I didn't come to ask for money," he began, his voice hoarse and slow. "Nor did I come to ask you to speak for me in court. The lawyers say I may escape prison because I didn't sign anything, didn't make any phone call. On paper, I'm innocent." He laughed, a dry laugh with no trace of joy. "Innocent. Does that sound funny to you? I sat at the head of the table in that house for 30 years. I knew every line of dirty money that flowed through the books from the 90s on. I knew what kind of woman my wife was before the children were even born. I knew she made that phone call that night. I was standing right outside the study door, and I did the one thing I have done best for 30 years. I turned away and poured myself a drink." He lifted his eyes to Fiona, and in them she saw a private hell no court could ever sentence him to. "People think crime requires hands," he said. "It doesn't. Crime only needs enough people to turn away. My 30 years of silence killed my son, the bravest boy in this family, the only one who was like me back when I still wasn't a coward." Then he placed his trembling hands on his knees, bowed his head low, and asked the question he had crossed the snowstorm to ask. "Can you forgive me?" Fiona was silent for a very long time, looking at the ruined man before her, and she realized the answer had already been inside her before he arrived, distilled through everything she had survived. "I forgive you," she said, slowly and clearly. He snapped his head up, and she raised one hand slightly to stop him. "Let me finish. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry hatred through the rest of my life. Hatred is heavy, Mr. Richard. I've carried it far enough, but you need to understand this properly. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't bring Grant back. It doesn't return my 6 months to me. And it doesn't mean you still have a place in my life. This door will not open for you a second time. Go home. Live out the years you have left with the truth you were finally brave enough to say. That is enough." Richard looked at her for a long time, then nodded, without arguing, without pleading. He stood, buttoned his overcoat with clumsy fingers, and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and said one final sentence without turning around. "He chose right, my boy. He was the only one in this family who chose right." Then his figure disappeared into the falling snow, a man free on paper and serving a life sentence inside himself. 3 days later, among the pile of letters Mr. Shaw forwarded to her, there was a handwritten envelope with her name on it, the handwriting careful and girlish. Inside were 4 pages from Brooke Ashcroft, asking for no money, asking for no meeting, asking for leniency for no one, only telling where she had stood behind the door on that October morning and how cowardly she had been, telling how she had seen the envelope from the insurance company on her mother's desk and had not dared ask, telling how she was now giving Special Agent Whitfield everything she knew, had moved out of every family property, and was working as a waitress in a small diner in Queens to support herself while learning a trade again. And the final line said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not worthy enough yet. I only want you to know that when you knelt down to pick up your things that morning, your back was still straighter than all the people standing there watching. I'm learning how to live so that one day I may be worthy enough to apologize to you." Fiona read the letter twice, sat silently by the window watching the snow fall for a long while, then took out paper and pen, and her reply contained only one line. "When you're worthy enough by your own standard, come find me. I can wait." Spring returned to Brooklyn the way it always returned, quietly and without warning. And on a sunny April morning, exactly 1 year after the day Grant left this world, a simple wooden sign was hung above a small storefront in the old neighborhood where the two of them had once lived, and carved into that sign were 3 plain words, "Grant's Table." Fiona had used most of the insurance money her husband had bought, with his own premonition of death, to open this diner, not an elegant restaurant, only a warm little place with wine-colored leather counterstools, the smell of roasted coffee and toasted bread, but it was built on principles she had paid a whole stretch of life to understand. Here, servers were paid a decent wage above the usual rate, given full insurance, allowed to sit down and eat 1 hot meal before every shift, and on the very first page of the employee handbook, Fiona had written 1 line with her own hand. "In this place, no one has to bow their head to keep a job, and any customer who insults a server will be shown to the door, no matter how expensive their order is." Casey Malone was the diner's first manager, still with red hair and a smile bigger than her face, and the newest server, hired just the week before, was a young woman with the last name Ashcroft, who was studying again at night college, and who stayed after every shift to wipe the counter more thoroughly than anyone else, as if paying back a debt no one had demanded. With another part of the insurance money, Fiona established a scholarship fund in her husband's name, for people in service work who wanted to return to school and finish a dream left unfinished, people like the Fiona of 8 years before. And the first application approved belonged to a young waiter who wanted to study nursing. And in Southampton, other changes were happening too, slowly and steadily. The yards were gradually moved into transparent contracts. The underground gambling houses closed one after another. Aldo complained that the master was making the lawyers 3 times richer because of the enormous amount of work required to legalize everything. And when Fiona asked Dario why, he answered with only 1 sentence, "Someone once told me to live a better life. I'm paying the debt a little late, but I'm paying it in full." Then one Saturday morning, when the diner was crowded and Fiona was standing behind the counter pouring coffee, the bell above the door rang, and a man in a gray suit walked in. No guards, no convoy, only himself, sitting down on the counter stool in front of her like the most ordinary customer in the world, ordering a cup of black coffee, drinking it slowly, and when she brought him the check, he did not take out his wallet. He placed something on the counter that she recognized at once, the carefully laminated plastic holding old, crumpled bills inside, $20 bills, $10 bills, limp $1 bills, the $87 still intact after 8 years inside a safe. "I came to repay my debt," Dario said, his eyes never leaving her as principal and interest, "with the rest of my life, if you allow it." Fiona looked at the laminated plastic, looked at the man who had stood in the rain 20 paces away from her, who had taken a bullet through the exact place of the old scar, who had learned how to wait better than anyone she had ever known, and she did not say yes, nor did she say not yet. She only pushed the laminated money back toward him, poured more coffee into his cup, and said, "This diner has a rule. Regulars don't have to pay in advance. Come every morning and pay it off little by little." And the smile that appeared on the face of New York's coldest man that morning was something the entire small diner saw, a door that did not need to be thrown wide open, only left unlocked. Fiona Donovan's story closed there, beside the wooden counter fragrant with coffee, and if everything had to be gathered into one truth, it was the truth she had come to understand after all of it, that the $50 million villa had never been the greatest gift. The greatest gift was the truth, because when a person knows clearly what they are worth, no one in the world can make them believe they are worthless anymore. No work is cheap, Only the way people treat one another can be cheap, and forgiveness is not a gift we give to those who hurt us. It is the burden we allow ourselves to set down. Dear viewers, the story ends here, and if these scenes made of words have touched your hearts, please press the like button and share this video so that this story of human dignity can reach someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to more compelling and profound stories. As for you, how do you feel about Fiona's journey? Have you ever witnessed someone being looked down on simply because of the work they do? And if you were in her place, would you have enough compassion to forgive as she did? Please share the feelings from deep within your heart in the comments section. We truly hope to hear every line of your thoughts. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of this story. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and